5 minutes.
But that's okay. I'm ready. Let's do it. Thanks so much for having me back. I was here about 4,500 days ago, 12 years, when there was a bill that was put forward that would have an unintended consequence of disempowering Elections Canada from participating in civic education activities for elementary and secondary school students. I had a really positive experience at the committee. You were clear-headed. You shared similar concerns with me and others, and an amendment was made. So thank you. Because of that, I trust this institution and I admire your work. I wonder if on rainy days, here, PROC members would like something good to put in their pockets. And I wanted to give you something tangible that at least came out of that work that you did with us and others. So I wanted to let you know that after that change, and Elections Canada was able to support what you might know as the Student Vote Parallel Election Program. A year later, this relates to all the witness testimony that's taken place so far and your topic. 7,600 schools registered and 920,000 Canadians under the voting age cast a student vote ballot. 2019, just under 10,000 schools registered, 1.2 million students cast a student vote ballot. 2021, 7,600 schools, 810,000 students cast a student vote ballot. Third week of September, about the worst time to do anything in schools, anytime.
Chair, the interpreter is raising that he has not received the speech, and can the witness slow down slightly or share the speech with the interpreter, please?
We didn't receive prepared remarks in advance. I just asked the witness if you could just be a little slower, and appreciate that for our interpreters. Thank you.
No problem.
Thank
Could
you.
I be slow and we could maybe re-add the time from the pause too?
We're good?
We're good?
Don't-
We're good? Okay, great. Sorry about that, and I will try my best to slow down. Not my greatest skill. And then last year's federal election, 7,100 schools, 1 million students cast a student vote ballot. As I said, on a rainy day, maybe you just want to recognize that you caused 4 million voting experiences within kids under the voting age through the work of this committee. So thank you. You sure picked a doozy on this standing order. And I cut it up a little bit. And I'll start with just a quick comment on what I think is the state of civic resilience in Canada right now. I actually think we're very resilient so far. So I've looked into civil resilience over the last few years, and it's led me to speak to the most amazing people here in this country and around the world. And there's a very special breed of people that I've had the privilege of speaking with, and that is past and current members of our armed forces. And I shared a meal with someone last night. His name's Dave. He was a major in the Canadian Army. He quit at the time of the Ukraine invasion, and he went and fought on the front lines. And he knows what I've been up to, and he said something when we left this really cute little pub on Elgin Street. He said, this is his exact words, "Resilience is the only thing you can't build during a war. Once the war starts, you can figure everything else out. If you don't have the will, you don't have anything." And I know we're not talking about a war today, and that's okay. But you could put a little blank space about that quote of resilience is the only thing you can't build during a blank space. So I think the second part of your standing order is about, well, what do you do to build resilience? That's my interpretation. And I think that what you're really looking at is attachment. That's what you want to do. And I think what you want to focus on is attachment to each other, Canada, and our values and ideals as a country. I think the one point I'll leave you with today is getting into the how. I love the how. I focused on the how for civic engagement and education for 20 years. It's what I do. Let's look at how do you get people to know each other and also get attached to Canada. And I think there's this incredible opportunity, and it seems a very different moment, on some of the things that our armed forces are exploring. And that's the growth of our primary reserve and the potential for a strategic reserve. I don't know if Mr. Williamson, that's you. There was a question in one of the testimonies from early on in this committee that talked about scale. It talked about, there's Katimavik that might have 10,000 kids a year or other things, and that's great. I'm used to hundreds of thousands and millions. We have an opportunity to encourage our armed forces to be entrepreneurial in how they look at the development of this supplementary and strategic reserve. So I'll leave you with that. I think there's a number of other things that I could comment on related to your previous witnesses. And again, I appreciate the work that you do.
Thank you so much. We'll now turn to Mr. Bridgman for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Committee, for the invitation. I also am being welcomed back. I was here in November for the foreign interference study, and at that time I talked about resilience, I talked about information integrity, and so I'm happy that now there's a dedicated study looking specifically at that, and happy to share kind of my thoughts and research and understanding with the committee. I direct the Media Ecosystem Observatory, which is sort of Canada's largest entity that monitors the information space, that monitors the way information emerges, is digested, and comes to shape the attitudes and behaviors of Canadians. And for many years now, me and others in sort of the information integrity space have been sounding the alarm. Most recently, this was sounded by Commissioner Hogue during the commission. And I want to talk a little bit today about three things that I think folks have a sense of, but I think really deserve attention in this study. The first is that we are, at the moment in Canada, operating in an information environment that is comparatively unregulated relative to many of our kind of peer countries. We are operating in a situation where the platforms are not providing data access, are not providing sort of base levels of accountability and visibility into what's going on. I have numerous examples I can speak to, but moments where parliamentarians such as yourself have asked platforms to provide even just a basic standard, a basic decent level of standard of transparency around an information operation, around inauthentic activity, and have been met with silence. Generally, the platforms, and I mean both social and AI platforms, are at a moment where they have been able to capture large parts of the market and have been able to be very effective and serve the interests of Canadian democracy in some ways, but also completely disregard others. And while there's been sort of several starts and fits in terms of legislative approaches, governance approaches, I really think we're at a moment where we look at other countries, we look at other jurisdictions, we look particularly at our European partners, and we are lagging far behind. And the time to act is far past, and that absolutely needs to happen. The second that I want to talk about is the way AI is going to be restructuring the information environment. There is considerable change already occurring. About a month ago, we released a study looking at the way AI agents are ingesting and repackaging Canadian journalism, and increasingly that is the way that Canadians are going to be getting and receiving information about their communities and about what's going on in the world around them. There's some responsible and interesting and innovative behavior in that space, but they are doing so in a way that is in their interests and not necessarily in the democratic interest, and certainly keeping a very close eye and monitoring that. In that study in particular, I wanted to highlight that we identified sort of some very clear exploitative behaviors, and particularly vis-a-vis the French language community in Canada and the underserving of French language journalism and the referencing of French language journalism. The third thing I just want to say is that we are in a moment where there's going to be massive change and massive acceleration of change. I think we're all tired of change. We're all tired of how fast the information environment has been shifting over the last decade or two. Buckle up. It's going to keep going. Very likely we're moving from a point, maybe many of your experiences kind of with AI is through sort of a chatbot type interface. That's certainly the way many Canadians are now using it. We are very quickly moving into an agentic space where individuals are tasking AI agents with seeking information and providing them with information. They are displaying very high levels of trust. This is an opportunity. This is an exciting moment. We should think about how that can support our democracy, how that can support civic resilience, how that can support information integrity. But there's also some dangers. This is also a fraught space, and it is going to be yet another radical restructuring of our society, yet another radical restructuring of our information environment at a time when we are still playing catch up. I have sort of two clear recommendations. There has been a sense for a while, I think, in Canada that the information environment cannot be regulated, cannot be governed for a variety of reasons. We need to disabuse ourselves of this notion. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit around data transparency, attribution, researcher access, basic levels of accountability. There's also some medium-hanging fruit if we talk about online harms. But this is possible, and this is urgent, and this absolutely needs to happen. The second is around civic resilience infrastructure, particularly in the information environment, but also thinking a little bit more broadly. The major program in this space, the Digital Citizen Initiative, is sunsetting. There are other programs that are sunsetting at the moment coming out of Heritage and other spaces. This is an opportunity to think about what we want to invest. I was heartened to sort of see there's the $31.5 million investment in improved capability to protect our information environment from foreign adversaries. But the civic resilience side is lagging behind, and that absolutely needs to be a priority over the next year. Last thing I'll say, if the chair will permit, is we have two very important moments. The Quebec election is coming up. The Alberta referendum is likely to occur at the end of the year. These are critical moments for our democracy. The information integrity is absolutely critical to those being successful democratic exercises.
Thank you so much. We'll now turn to Mr. Blask for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, members of the committee. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Chris Blask. I'm co-founder and CEO of QuietWire, a Canadian AI infrastructure company. My work lives at the intersection of cybersecurity, institutional trust, community memory, and practical AI deployment. I want to start with a simple claim. Civic resilience is not mainly a messaging problem. It is an infrastructure problem. When people stop trusting institutions, trusting what they hear, when they no longer know where local truth lives, where institutions feel distant, and when communities lose the ability to interpret events together, that's when resilience starts to fail. And when that happens, no amount of centralized messaging fixes it. You cannot communication strategy your way out of a trust deficit. So resilience starts closer to the ground than that. It starts in communities that still know themselves, communities that can still remember what happened, still recognize who they trust, still connect present events with shared meaning, and still act through human relationships. That may sound abstract, but in practice, it is very concrete. A resilient community needs trusted people, shared memory, credible local institutions, and tools that help people make sense of events without taking agency away from them. This is where I think Canada should focus. At QuietWire, that is the direction we're building towards. Local practical AI systems that help communities, institutions, and businesses preserve continuity, strengthen memory, and remain legible to themselves over time. Not as a replacement for people and not as a centralized platform that hoovers up data, but as infrastructure that supports human judgment, stewardship, and local trust. It is not the only answer to this problem, but I do believe it is a useful Canadian answer. A lot of the public conversation around civic resilience drifts very quickly towards disinformation, moderation, platform policy, and centralized response. Those things matter, but they are downstream. If people feel like they're only being spoken to, managed, corrected, or nudged, that does not build resilience, usually does quite the opposite. People become more resilient when they are better connected to one another, when they can see themselves reflected in their institutions, and when they have real ownership over the systems that shape local understanding. That is where AI becomes useful as a tool for continuity, recall, interpretation, and service at the local level. Used properly, AI can help communities preserve knowledge, access memory, support education, and strengthen institutional continuity. It can help a place remain legible to itself over time. And importantly, this does not mean this does not have to mean only the largest institution with the largest budgets. Canada can support approaches that are accessible to ordinary municipalities, libraries, Indigenous communities, schools, and small and medium-sized organizations as well, and that matters. It's a different thing from using AI to manufacture consensus or push narratives from the top down. I think that distinction is one of the most important ones this committee could hold. A healthy approach to civic resilience is not centralized narrative management. It is distributed, human-anchored, community-owned capability. If I were to leave you with 3 practical recommendations, they would be these. First, treat civic resilience as infrastructure, not just as a communications concern, but as something that deserves real support, experimentation, and long-term institutional backing. Second, invest in community memory and trust systems. Municipalities, libraries, indigenous communities, schools, local civic bodies, these places need tools that help preserve knowledge, maintain continuity, and support local meaning making. Third, support human stewards, not just technology. Every system that actually works still depends on trusted people on the ground. If Canada wants resilience, it should be backing the people who hold local trust: educators, librarians, archivists, municipal leaders, operators, and community custodians. So my central point is this: Canada will not become more civically resilient by becoming more centralized, more abstract, or more managerial. It will become more resilient by becoming more local, more legible, more trusted, and more connected from the community up. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you so much. We'll now go to questions from members. We'll start with Mr. Van Popta for 6 minutes, please.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses for coming here today and sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us as we undertake a study on the state of civic resilience in Canada today. So, Mr. Gunn, maybe I'll start with you. You talked about voter engagement and the work that your organization has been doing in encouraging young people to get involved. I think maybe that work has borne some fruit. Since I understand that in the last election, 2025, voter participation among younger people has gone up. However, overall, our voter turnout is not that great. There was a record turnout back in 1958 in the John Diefenbaker landslide of 80%. That's sort of the benchmark, and it's been sliding since then. It sort of bumps up and down a little bit, but provincially sometimes it's very low. And in by-elections, it's particularly low. So perhaps you could comment on that, voter turnout and how that ties into a sense of civic resilience.
Sure. And just to clarify, too, I haven't been with Civics for 4 years, but I was just kind of reflecting on my past time here at the committee. Still admire the work of that organization. Also, too, Mr. Van Popta, just wanted to wish you congratulations because of all the committee members. You were in 3rd place in the last federal election for the number of ballots cast in your electoral district by the kids, just under 5,000. So
Get out the vote.
that's right. Good for you. Good for you. Yeah, 21 schools in your electoral district participated. When I was young, much younger, I thought that voter turnout was the best measure of the health of a democracy. I still think it's a clue, but I don't think it's the best measure. I think we have a different generational interpretation of a sense of civic duty and to electoral participation. That doesn't make me happy or comfortable with the decline in voter turnout. And you're right, we've seen some hope in the recent federal election and some of the past recent federal elections among youth voter turnout. And thank goodness Elections Canada actually monitors and studies that. I think that I'm not entirely uncomfortable with the change. I think we just need to acknowledge it. I still also don't think we should give up on a sense of civic duty. I also don't think we should believe that collectivism, or whatever that means, is a replacement to electoral participation. I think that it's a fundamental act of citizenship, and we should always treat it as such. I think we need continued actions, which would be great with more investments into civic education. We need to, Chris was a fantastic witness. I don't know Chris personally, other than a couple LinkedIn messages, but his concept of community and bottom up rather than top down in how you look at some of these issues around civil resilience, I firmly believe in. And I think we need to keep working at it. It's not something to give up. It's not going to be fixed overnight, and we all have a role to play, even yourselves, in how you are on committee, how you are in the House, how you are on at home, in people's trust in institutions.
Good.
Angus?
Thank you. Mr. Bridgman, I'll swing over to you. You talked about where Canada is in regulating platforms, and I think that you're being critical of Canada being a laggard there. But we do have C-18, which became law in the last Parliament. So do you think that, and again, we're talking about civic resilience, civic engagement, so is C-18 a net benefit or a net detraction from that, in your opinion?
The link that is sort of very explicitly drawn is the quality of Canadian journalism and the output of Canadian journalism and civic resilience. And this has been sort of a priority by the government to sort of that these two things are linked, that the higher quality of production of information locally will ensure or will help civic resilience. And I think that concept and that idea is fundamentally sound, that what we want is high quality, easily available information to every citizen to help them make informed decisions. And so that's where we should start from. Now, the question of whether or not C-18 has been successful, there have been two major effects. One is $100 million a year from Google to support Canadian journalism. That means that there are more journalists writing stories and more availability. So that's maybe good. But there's been this enormous harm that has been done, which is that news is now not widely available on Facebook and Instagram. And I think that decision by Meta to remove news was not written in stone. There's sort of the chain here. There's the C-18 and then there's the Meta decision. And I think the Meta decision largely relies on a loophole. The loophole here is that they have interpreted very directly that news outlets cannot post and individuals cannot post news links. And they have said because those two things are not happening, we are not a news distributor. They are a news distributor. If you ask Canadians today where they get their news, you can ask them. We have published results on this. They will say, I get my news from Facebook and Instagram. That's where I go to get my news. And so we have an impossible situation here. We are saying, oh, they are not subject to this law. They are not paying into this fund because they are not news distributors. At the same time, depending on the platform, 40 to 50% of Canadians are saying, I get my news on that platform. It's an inherent contradiction and one that I am deeply concerned about and speaks to all sorts of sort of challenges here. But I think that absolutely sort of needs to continue to be considered. The other piece here about C-18 that is really sort of an ongoing question is its applicability to AI platforms. In the AI news audit that I mentioned, today if you go to any AI chatbot and you ask about a recent Canadian news event, they will provide, and our study documents this in sort of, I would say, painful detail, they will provide you with a proximate substitute to what Canadian journalist content, and they will do so by fetching the journalist content, packaging it, and providing it to you as their own product.
Thank you so much. Sorry, we're over time. We'll go to Ms. Van den Beld, please, for 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you very much. And I want to thank all three of the witnesses for some very good ideas. I want to start with you, Professor Gunn, because you, of course, through the work with civics, you do things like connect young people to their elected representatives, help demystify the process. And I really like the word that you used when you talked about attachment. And I just wanted to follow up on that because I think one of the challenges that we have is that I've often said people have stopped listening to each other. They're getting that feedback loop in their social media, the polarization. And I wonder if you could talk about the need to have forums where people of differing views could talk to each other and hear each other and have discussions. And I'm thinking of in the US, they have things like Search for Common Ground, millions of conversations where they have dinner parties with people of different views. What do you, and one of the things that I do every Friday is I have an open Zoom coffee hour with constituents, and anybody can join and they set the topics and people hear each other. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can do as a government to support that kind of conversation and attachment?
I mean, I'll try. It's a tricky one. I think we also need to remember that we have some things that disattach us from each other. These, I'd say screens in general. I think that's been documented for a long time. You know, when I started working in schools, 2002, 2003, I remember how offensive it was to consider something like a corporate logo on an in-school poster. I remember that, and I took it seriously because schools are sacred places. But just a few years later, every kid in school boards started to get a Gmail address. And I was wondering, is there a little bit of some hypocrisy here between you can't have a corporate logo, but everybody is getting a Gmail address? And then I think we were also delusional, about the benefits of technology in schools, continuing to grip kids to screens as a form of learning. There's some people I can recommend that would speak about how that hasn't worked for students. So we have things that work against us all the time. If you bring people together in person, you don't find polarization. And part of what it is that you lose your social capital if you say some of the things in person that you would say online. And you're also not anonymous. I think for a long time, everyone was like, let's meet young people where they are, presuming that they were on Instagram. I don't think that was ever a good idea. We should have always been doing things in person. I know it's more expensive, but I think we might now be waking up to the idea that maybe great things are just more expensive. There's also a role to play for how, and this isn't me being, mean or inconsiderate, but I think how you all treat each other publicly actually does some role modeling for our people and how we talk to each other. The worse you speak to each other, the more okay it is for people to not speak kindly to each other. We have a really bad example of that close to us, not in our country. And educators will tell people that kids will role model what they see from the highest voices in the land. So it's just something to factor into this type of thing. None of it, Ms. Villaren is I just can't see that far, is easy. It's a work in progress. But I think that the more we're off these, the more socially cohesive we just naturally are.
Thank you. And Mr. Blask, I'd like to go to you next because you said some interesting things. You said that the concern about disinformation is actually downstream, and building on this idea of the human connection, about really reinforcing those connections, memory, institutions. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the same thing, but also adding there are productive and constructive ways of engagement, and then through social media, there can also be some ways of engagement that can actually create more polarization and distrust in institutions. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit of that in the context of your work.
Sure. So I've spent most of the last 35 years focusing on cyber resilience, cybersecurity, and so forth. And that's taken me down all the paths, globally, nation states, organizations, and all the kind of conflict spaces. And this, the last 7 years, I've been focusing on supply chain security, right? And I've been chairing the U.S. Department of Homeland Security supply chain sharing information sharing working groups, and talking with the global cohort on how we get trust across supply chains in the world we're going in, and not just current events. It's getting fractally more complicated. So I think that what we see in social media, what we call social media, is similar to what we see in other infrastructure, that there's a level of immaturity that does not yet hold the reality of the relationships that we express in business and in this context in civil and in communities and so forth. And so this is, my view and our view is that all of these issues need to be solved locally, and we finally have the tech and so forth to do that. We ended up with centralized control, with Google and all these big things, not because that's the way the internet was intended to be built, but that's what worked at the time. And a number of, I think we're fairly fortunate that a number of technical evolutions are coming together right about the time we really need to take it away from the cloud and put it in the local community.
Okay,
So,
I'm going to have to interrupt there. Thank you so much. We're going to turn to Madame Belfoy for 6 minutes. If you, to our witnesses, if you don't speak French, if you can put in your earphones, or Mr. Blask, make sure you're on the French translation service. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Donc,
Thank you, Chair. This is the Francophone portion of the meeting, so you can practice your French. I would like to thank our interpreters as well. I'm the first one. You'll be the second one. I'm the first one. I didn't say anything wrong. So, Chair, I would like to thank our interpreters who are here in person, and I can say that I am receiving excellent interpretation from them, and I would like to thank them. I know that it's not always easy, especially when we don't have a speech in front of us, and so I would like to thank you. I see you smiling, and I wanted to share that with you. And I know that you'll interpret me well as well. Mr. Gunn, I agree with you. Our young people are growing up in an environment where there's a lack of humanity. And they don't have great critical thinking, and they seem to think that what they're reading is true, even though they are limited and they only look at social media and how social media is created. Well, it always suggests what we want to hear, and so people are not developing that critical thinking or nuanced thinking, even adults. As an MP, I receive a lot of emails from people saying that they read something and so it's true. And we're losing that critical thinking. And social acceptance, or rather, people think that if someone is not with them, they are against them. And social media is a bit of a cancer right now. It doesn't help people develop critical thinking. Programs that recreated elections in schools were a great tool, but we need to do more in educating our young people so that they develop tools to become good citizens while understanding societal issues and understanding the environment that we live in. And so I agree with you entirely. Cities, provinces, the federal government, we all need to act and understand that there are risks that children might become more limited. Being for or against means or includes judgment and doesn't have a nuanced thought, and I find that concerning. I also agree with you, Mr. Brickman. For social media, there are things that we can do at the federal government and that we have not yet done. It's not normal, for example, that social media platforms are removing news and are keeping our young people from being informed regarding what's happening in our municipalities, our communities. It's cutting off ties with communities because Meta, for example, is refusing to share news. I admired Ms. Freeland when she told Meta that they would have to pay in order to support communities and help inform communities, and then the government went back on that commitment and asking Meta to pay its part. And what could we do? I believe that Europe is more advanced than we are regarding the powers of those big social media platforms. And what can we do against for Meta? That's a great question. There is the problem of Meta specifically. It is a player that has caused a lot of harm, especially to local news. These larger chains in Toronto, Ottawa, Montreal, it's difficult for them, but it is very difficult for small cities as well. I believe that there are many things that we can do. We have legislation that can be applied. I'm not a lawyer, but I see that, and they are already sharing news. They are making a lot of profits through ads in Canada, but currently we're overly cautious. We're too afraid to take on these big American companies. And I do understand the larger political context, but I am wondering whether or not being timid has helped us recently. Was it useful? Did Canada succeed in getting what it was seeking in being timid with those platforms? Also, we need to look at large AI platforms. There are big players with Meta and Google, but there's going to be OpenAI and Propet, Perplexity, Cohere. There are so many players. And if we don't put in place guidelines, they're going to do exactly the same thing. 5 seconds. I will thank you then, and hopefully we'll be able to come back to that in the next turn. Thank you.
Turn to Mr. Jackson for 5 minutes, please.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Welcome to the witnesses again. Thank you for being here and for sharing your views and expertise with us. We sincerely appreciate it. Just actually to build a little bit on what Madame de Bellefeuille was going on about there with respect to you, Mr. Bridgman, you came in your two recommendations. One of them is that you do believe that these big social media companies, this social media environment can be regulated. But then in responding to a question from Mr. Van Popta, we kind of outlined, C-18 happened. This was the reaction of Meta. It didn't go very favorably because now we have this vacuum, as you, I think, maybe didn't use the word vacuum, but that's basically what it's become. And so they didn't play ball at all with the government's attempt. And so I'm just curious, and yet you recommend that they would participate if there were regulation that was brought in some type or form. And so I'm just curious what evidence you could present to this committee that big corporations like Meta, in which now the Canadian market is very small relative to their presence globally, what evidence do you have that they would in fact participate with any government regulations that the Government of Canada might bring in?
This is always the question with any corporation. If we, any large corporation, if we try to regulate, will they cooperate? We have evidence that Google did cooperate in that instance. Meta has chosen not to, and I've talked about the loophole, and I've talked about the timidity with which we have approached this and our acceptation of their framing of this issue around link tax and other things. Canada is globally a small player, but likely in the Meta case, what was going on there and what continues to go on is that it's not about the Canadian market and the Canadian dollars, it's about the global context. It's about the extent to which they were afraid that this was going to happen in California, in New York, and around the world, right? And so they were trying to draw a line in the sand. Nevertheless, Meta, Facebook usage is enormously high in Canada. There are ads. They make enormous amounts of money in the Canadian context and have a responsibility. I do not think that it is okay for us to say, they're big, therefore we can't regulate it. I would just say, how has that served us in terms of the social platforms? Do we look at society today vis-a-vis 20 years ago and say, we are clearly more democratically enabled, we are more resilient, we are more capable? I don't think that we are. I think that there are enormous, there are networks, there's the ability of citizens to talk to one another, and there is enormous advantages of that. But I think that we can do better.
Thank you. I guess, I feel, and maybe I've heard from different people that feel that they are more connected now than ever, and they're freer to have these discussions as opposed to, before Meta, when it was a phone call, mail, like in the traditional sense, email, of those types of conversations. And so I'm not advocating that, we shouldn't try because they're big. That I'm just curious if you had examples of other countries where they had regulated and Meta had not taken a decision like they did with C-18, but they actually went along with what the government was trying to impose.
Australia is the obvious example.
Okay.
There have been a variety of bargaining codes where there's been a requirement to bargain with news outlets, and that's a model around the world that has happened. That was attempted in the Canadian context as well. So yes, often when I come and I do these appearances and I talk, I come across sort of techno-pessimistic, that there's not going to... I agree. Local Facebook groups, community groups, I'm in my local towns, they're great. They allow connection. Why can't we have both? Why can't we have the news on Meta and the ability to have these connections? I mean, there is a way to do that. And I think that the fear of when this occurred and when Meta pulled out and the geopolitical context, that has changed. And this should be revisited.
You mentioned your second recommendation was about digital resilience infrastructure. And I just wondered, one of your colleagues on the panel mentioned libraries, this type of thing, but I wondered if you had specific examples of what digital resilience infrastructure would look like that you would recommend.
Very brief answer, please.
Sorry, Chair.
That's okay.
So there was the Digital Citizen Initiative, and there were a variety of programs that often were short time horizon. There were a lot of great programs. The reporting's there. There's been a really vibrant experimental space, and I think looking at those programs really seriously and the ones that worked is a really great place to start.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wilkinson for 5 minutes, please.
I would also like to thank the witnesses for their participation. Maybe I can start with Mr. Gunn, and it's a three-part question. You obviously have worked a lot on civic education through experiential learning, and so the Rep Day program to engage with members of Parliament, the student vote program bringing the voting closer to students. So can you just, at a basic level, explain why this kind of positive engagement in democracy is important? Can you also talk a little bit about whether it's your direct experience or observations of other things, what has typically been most important? And then thirdly, I did mention the issue of scale in a previous meeting, and student vote is a good example of being able to scale. But for outside of the school environment, do you have ideas about how you can do public engagement effectively at scale?
Questions. Sorry, just scale outside of schools. Okay. So your first question, I think, was about why is it important, for student vote, Rep Day, other types of programs. Where else do you see stuff like that happening in a young person's life outside of a school? I don't. You may, in some families, have a great positive reinforcement of democratic participation or service. I'm going to try to go slow. My apologies. Schools remain this sacred space, and educators remain these highly committed, dedicated Canadians who want to create citizens before they create employees. There isn't anywhere else for that, right? So that, to me, is why that's important. You asked what has been most important. Is that kind of what have I seen that's the most effective, or yeah? So maybe I'll turn that into what are things that, there's a way of looking at this. I think you may be looking at new things to do, right? There's been a talk about a democracy fund or stuff like this. I think what you want to do is first, before anything else, is just identify your assets. What do you have that you can use and strengthen before you worry about creating something new? That would be my first thing. Again, I'm out of the group, so it doesn't benefit me in any way. But if you were worried about something like media literacy or civic education, you could look at a group like Civics, who has 60,000 committed teachers that they can turn on a dime in a snap federal election to get 1 million kids to do something. That's what I'm talking about when you're looking at your assets. And maybe I'll take that into this kind of scale outside of schools. You probably all know this. Maybe there's a bit of an age difference in the room. Maybe there isn't. I'm 48. But a lot of our civic infrastructure in the past was built by community groups. The Lions clubs, the Rotary clubs, other types of things that really don't exist in any way of the same way as they did 10, 20 years ago, right? You can go to different academics who would tell you it has been influenced by this, our entertainment or technology. But I wonder if there's a way that it could be time for a resurgence in that type of public activity, shared activity, face-to-face activity between each other. And it could be done in a number of different ways. I'm privy to some research that isn't out yet, but it involved 2,500 middle and high school students across the country. And it asked them if there was a national service program that was meant to, help you meet other people, learn some skills. Maybe there's a little bit of an honorarium or something like this. Would you be interested? 25% of the kids said right off the top, I'd be interested. But 45%, I would be interested, but it might be better for somebody else. But all they saw was a paragraph, right? Like, what could we do that involves people and gives them constructive outlets where they can learn skills? And that's why I was bringing up these ideas about this infrastructure, like what our armed forces is about to try to do. Maybe they could turn more outward facing, be less insular. What are the other existing assets that we can use to cause public engagement? I don't know about you, but my kids are learning their city and getting to know kids outside of their classroom simply because of the sports that they're involved in. There shouldn't be any impediment whatsoever to having families and people play together. I know this involves like the provinces and the municipalities, and some of the municipalities do this so well, but kids should be playing together. And it's not just soccer, right? My younger guy doesn't want to play soccer, but he could do other things. So we need to look at how we really, grow that. Another thing, too, this goes maybe a little bit beyond that, but we have the best asset we could use to cause public engagement is our geography. If you want to know Canada, you just need to get out of wherever you live and get to know this country. I thought that the train pass thing was a great thing, but the flights are ridiculous. And the problem is you can't take a train for 4 days for most people. You can't have a 10-day trip across Canada to spend a day in Halifax.
I'm going to have to interrupt.
Go for it. I said enough. He got me going. And
it was very interesting. We will have time to continue. We'll now go to Madame de Belfoy for 2.5 minutes, please.
Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Just to come back to our discussion, Mr. Brigman, one of the first decisions of the Carney government was to abandon taxing these bigger companies. These funds could have better supported our local media, and they reach out to communities and they bring local news, and they could counteract what is shared on social media. Is that not a failure? The federal government perhaps thought removing this would help in dealing with the American government, but perhaps we should review a potential tax in order to support local and regional news. Absolutely. Supporting local information, we absolutely need that. Having that tax is one way to do it. We also need to look into where people are spending their time. We have carried out studies that show that Canadians turn to influencers for getting their information. I don't like that. Influencers are not regulated. They do what they want. I've spoken with influencers and creators who take their responsibility seriously, but they are overwhelmed by everything that's going on. Even for me, as a researcher who spends my time trying to understand what's going on, it's difficult. So yes, absolutely, we need to invest in the production of local information, but the way we do that is very important as well. We need to reflect and see how we're going to do that well, how we are going to understand the information ecosystem and see who will be sharing this information and how we can empower them. I only have a few seconds left, so I would like to thank you for sharing this good news, and we do need people like you, because I think that we are on the wrong track. Currently, we are too timid, and I think we're going to pay the price for that later with the kind of Canadian citizen that we are developing. So I hope that the alarms that you're raising will be heard.
Ms. Cronus, please, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I want to thank the witnesses for their really insightful comments, but I also really want to compliment the clerk because the way that these witnesses have been put together, the way that they complement each other has actually been a pleasure to listen to. And just to tie that, to make that point, Mr. Blask made the point that people feel better connected when they can see themselves reflected in their institutions. And Professor Bridgman talked about how AI is restructuring a relatively unregulated information environment. And he also talked about the high level of trust that people put in AI. And one of you talked about the prevailing perspective of I get my news here, that AI fetches the content, packages it, and presents it as facts. And I think that was also Professor Bridgman. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to actually ask you, Mr. Gunn, what happens when someone builds their own AI model using only sources that they already agree with?
We may all have the answer of that. Angus would be the technical expert on something like this, but you'd be talking to yourself.
Well, and so in that context, you know, we've talked so far in this session, there's been a lot of focus on the messenger. There's been a lot of focus on the AI platforms, Meta, and the other social media platforms. And I think that that actually lets us as citizens in a lot of way off the hook. And so if an AI system is trained to prioritize what a user already believes, how does a person challenge bad ideas or correct the errors that they might be learning in that process?
I'm just going to note, because I think it's really important, and it shouldn't be abandoned or excused, which is our own personal responsibility as citizens. It's not going to land well with maybe your average 17-year-old, but I'm just going to say it because I believe in that. I do think that it's very difficult with technology and how it's been designed to work with us. I have a small theory. I could be totally wrong, and Angus or Mr. Blask would know this better, but I bet that people wouldn't use social media so much or post so much if there wasn't a like button. I see this on LinkedIn. I don't want to be on LinkedIn. I've actually used it for a reasonable amount of interesting information, but you know, I know people are doing this for the likes, and I just wonder if they took that out, that small little dopamine hit. I don't know if any of you have experimented with your dopamine levels, but it really, this stuff really is a low-level dopamine addiction. Might be half a cigarette, but it is. Trust me.
Well, and what happens then when people start to trust those devices that you're holding up? What happens when people start to trust those personalized AI systems more than they trust the sources, the independent experts and journalists, those influencers that Mr. Bridgman, that Professor Bridgman was a bit down on? What happens to our civic resilience under those circumstances?
It lessens dramatically, and I think we're facing that already. And what you might then say is like, well, what else would you do?
Actually, the question I want to ask there is, who should be held accountable for that?
Probably the people that build the systems, split between our own responsibility. Is that a fair way to put it? The only thing is they're going to fight against that, and so maybe we shouldn't wait for the day that they fix it themselves. One of the first things we might look at is how much do young people or people of all age simply even know Canadian news brands and understand what goes into journalism? Because I think that's very low. That's the first problem. Angus is right, and you should maybe go on this, Angus, because you know it better than me, but the replacement of even the recognition of a brand within a summary of a news article, you're stealing from journalism, and the computer is spitting out at you a summary. It's wrong. I don't know how anyone pays for this. And it reinforces the idea that you can get simple, fast information that may not even be accurate from a news system. It's not social media anymore. It's our LLMs. Do you want to detail this, Angus, since you're more knowledgeable?
No, please go ahead.
Just very quickly, the current consumer-facing behavior of AI systems for news replacement is a much higher quality in general product than what you would typically encounter in your average social media feed.
But that having been said, do most users actually understand how their custom AI has been trained, and to what extent are they actually placing blind trust in something that they can't really evaluate?
Almost no one has.
Going to have to cut you off there. We'll turn to Madame Brière for 5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président. Et merci.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our three witnesses for being with us today. The discussion has been very interesting, and I agree with my colleague. Your testimonies are very relevant. Mr. Gunn, in your opening remarks and in the opening remarks of Mr. Blask, you talked about the importance of developing an attachment, creating new links, and that civic resilience is a structural issue, and we have to develop some human relationships. 2 weeks ago, in my riding in Sherbrooke, we had an activity called Sharing Bread. So groups like Scouts, Cadets, they were all there. They were doing door-to-door, and they were offering bread to community members. There was a kiosk where you could buy bread, and I saw through that the beauty of those young people, their goodwill, their discipline. They wanted to help. They wanted to share these wonderful values that they're learning through those groups. I wanted to know that if we could build upon that, would that be a good way of increasing engagement? There are different ways of increasing engagement, but would that be a good way in your view?
I'd hate to be the person that would disagree with that. That would be awful. Who is that person? Who is that guy? Yeah, that's exactly the thing. I think that there's already I'll say it like this. What's really interesting to me is that all of the military investments right now are talking about dual use, right? You're going to build a hospital for a base in the north, but that hospital is going to serve the community. We already have this potential for a dual use social infrastructure, which is groups like that benefit the participants, but they also benefit our civil resilience. So I think it's a matter of some of these, they can self-identify and volunteer. The others can be externally identified, but we want to bolster that in any way that we possibly can. I think, though, what we may have seen is a decrease in participation in a lot of those traditional, you named the Scouts. For sure, them and the Girl Guides don't have the same amount of numbers that they had in the past. I'm pretty sure of this. And I think maybe we just need to change our culture, and which is maybe just change our culture. That's a fun thing to say. But how can we make it more habitual and dedicated that those are the priorities of participation for our kids before they're ever on this in any way? This hasn't worked. Let's go back to what was working. There's nothing wrong with that. I'm not saying let's go back and all be farmers, as awesome as that would be. But we're not all going to do that. How do we go back and we build out this, we just participate in this existing social infrastructure because you have a better life because of it. I'm going to give you a quick example because it changed my life. During the virus time, I used to worry about millions of kids, and then I started worrying about dozens of people in my neighborhood because we took over this volunteer rink, this ice rink. I didn't even skate. I just liked the idea of building something. So I started worrying about dozens of people. And, now we have a group of about 60 volunteers, and we've done this new thing where we get together around a fire for a celebratory meal and we cook. People say that they just haven't done that before in their own communities. And it's kind of sad, but it's also hopeful because it's like, so it's just this we need to do? And I think we just lost that. And it's just a matter of all of us putting in our own. It's risky. It's risky to make new friends. It's risky to get it into your community. But I think we all need to take that risk and build it back ourselves.
Bravo et merci d'avoir.
Congratulations. And thank you so much for sharing that example with us. How then can we attract young people to those groups? How can we ensure that adults are also encouraging young people to participate in such events?
This Angus. So part of those survey results that aren't out yet, kids want more face-to-face interaction. They want it. So you look at things like, for example, in Ontario, and there's some other consistencies about this across the country, service is a part of the school curriculum. But what type of opportunities are available for those to participate in service? Sure, you learn something licking envelopes and, putting it in the thing for an NGO, if that opportunity even exists. What could be out there that is much more substantial, constructive, maybe longer term, that kids could get involved in? I think that's actually what we're missing.
Thank you so much. We will now suspend for a few minutes for the next panel. I'd like to thank the clerk for herding the cats, which is always a challenge in the House of Commons. We'll proceed with our second panel from the Agri-Food Analytics Lab. Sylvain Charlebois, Director and Professor. This is always a challenge for me. Dalhousie University. Yeah. From Euphrosyne Foundation, Nive Leonard, the Executive Director, and from the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, John Carpe, President and Founder. We'll go to Dr. Charlebois for 5 minutes, please, and I will be pretty strict on the 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, honorable members and committee, thank you for the invitation to appear before you today to discuss the current state of civic resilience in Canada, an issue that is both timely and fundamental to the health of our democracy. I appear before you as a researcher specializing in food systems, supply chains, and consumer behavior. While my work focuses on agri-food, the insights extend far beyond it. Food is one of the most immediate and tangible ways Canadians experience economic pressure, institutional performance, and, importantly, trust. Over the past several years, Canada has faced a series of shocks, pandemic disruptions, geopolitical instability, and sustained food inflation. These events have tested not only our supply chains, but also public confidence in institutions. And civic resilience, at its core, depends on that confidence. Allow me to offer 3 examples that illustrate the challenges we are facing. First, the role of media and open discourse. Earlier this month, my 25-year collaboration with La Presse, during which I wrote over 1,000 columns for free, came to an end. This followed concerns I had publicly expressed as a citizen on social media about how public funding for private sector media could potentially influence editorial decisions. What is important here is not disagreement. Debate is essential in a healthy democracy. But the reaction was surprising. No other media organization responded in the same way. This raises broader questions about how comfortable we are collectively with challenging prevailing narratives. Civic resilience depends on our ability to sustain open, pluralistic dialogue without disproportionate consequences. Second, the issue of industrial carbon pricing and its indirect effects on Canadians. While the consumer carbon charge has been removed, the industrial carbon price continues to rise, now reaching $110 per ton. In the agri-food sector, these costs do not disappear. They are embedded across supply chains, from processing to transportation to distribution. Many businesses are adjudicating quietly, often through surcharges or contract changes. Yet, very few media outlets are examining these dynamics closely. We have. This gap matters. When citizens sense the real economic pressures are not being fully acknowledged or explained, it can erode trust in both institutions and the information ecosystem meant to inform them. Third, the Loblaw boycott, counter-terrorists implemented by Ottawa. I can go on and on and on. Many examples. Taken together, these examples point to a common thread. Civic resilience is not only about how institutions perform, but how they are perceived, understood, and trusted. From my perspective, threatening civic resilience in Canada requires action in 3 key areas. First, transparency. Canadians need clear, more accessible information, whether about public policy, pricing mechanism, and institution decision-making. 2, accountability. Institutions must not only act fairly, but be seen to act fairly. Perception is critical, and trust is difficult to rebuild once lost. And third, engagement. Canadians must feel that their voices matter and that open dialogue is encouraged. Civic resilience depends on participation, just not on compliance. In closing, civic resilience is not a fixed condition. It is dynamic and must be actively maintained. If Canadians begin to lose confidence in the institutions that shape their daily lives, whether governments, markets, or media, then resilience weakens. But with transparency, accountability, and open dialogue, it can be strengthened. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. Madame Léonard, 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee. My name is Neve Leonard. I am the Executive Director of the Euphrosyne Foundation, which supports charities protecting and expanding the democratic spaces where people participate and hold power to account. Before I dive in, I want to acknowledge that many of you have spent decades doing the work I'm about to speak about, meeting people in community centers and diners who carry big dreams but feel that the political system is broken. You know better than most what it takes to show someone that our system can still hold their hopes. My own path into this work started when I was 19, stopping my peers on sidewalks, asking them to pledge to vote. I was not there to sell them a party. I was there because I believed, and I still do, that people deserve the information, the confidence, and the space to decide for themselves. That conviction has carried me from the nonprofit sector to law to philanthropy, always with the belief that the greatest service we can do for others is to support their agency. I am here to make one central argument. Canada should create a Canadian Democracy Fund, dispersing $20 million a year through an arm's-length granting mechanism to support on-ramps into the democratic system. This proposal was developed collectively and is now endorsed by more than 130 leaders across the country. I will make 4 points in support. So first, the need is urgent. Second, the fund would support our defense commitments. Third, our allies are moving ahead with similar initiatives. And fourth, the fund is feasible. So first, what's the problem? Democracy is in retreat worldwide. It's no secret now but that just 26% of the world's population now lives in a democracy. And here at home, only 40% of Canadians believe that the political system allows them to have a say, let alone a meaningful one. And shockingly, 1 in 4 feel that our institutions need to be torn down. The distance between people and their institutions is the space hostile actors and extremist movements are rushing to exploit. And now is the time to strengthen our democratic immune system. Second, this work would support our defense commitments. Canada recently spent $63 billion on defense, meeting its 2% NATO target. It now plans to raise that commitment to 5% of GDP. But defense spending alone is insufficient. The NATO Parliamentary Assembly has adopted a resolution urging allied states to allocate a portion of the 1.5% in defense and security-related investments to strengthening democratic resilience through a whole-of-society approach, partnering with civil society to strengthen information systems, promote digital and media literacy, and build civic engagement. The strongest safeguard of our democracy is not tanks and bombs. It is people who believe that their country is theirs to shape. Third, our allies are moving ahead. The European Union, fighting an authoritarian regime at its doorstep, understands the importance of investing in democratic resilience. Last year, it launched the EU Democracy Shield, a unified strategy to safeguard the information space, strengthen elections and independent media, and boost citizen engagement. This strategy is backed by a proposed €9 billion commitment to this work, which is a doubling of the EU's previous investments in this area. And fourth, the fund is feasible. The Canadian Democracy Fund would provide $20 million annually through an arm's-length granting mechanism. It would support nonpartisan organizations working with people directly on the ground, like many the committee has already heard from, organizations that run electoral and media literacy programs, design and implement citizens' assemblies, make government proceedings accessible to the public, and counter hate, discrimination, and polarization. These organizations are effective, they're nonpartisan, and they're under-resourced. A Canadian Democracy Fund would allow them to scale. The philanthropic sector is already mobilizing. In January, more than 20 Canadian foundations convened for the inaugural meeting of Democracy Funders Canada, a new network committed to strengthening the pillars of our democracy. So to conclude, Mr. Chair, Canada invests billions to defend against threats at our borders, but the deeper threat is Canadians no longer believing that our democratic institutions are worth engaging with, let alone protecting. It is time to invest here at home in bringing people to our institutions and our institutions to people. Politics should not be something that is done to us by people far away. It is how we negotiate our shared life across geographies, ideologies, religions, and languages. It belongs to us all. We will know we have succeeded when people from Cochrane to Iqaluit to Rimouski to Gander feel that they are co-designers of our democracy and not mere tenants within it. Thank you. I welcome your questions.
Seconds. That was exceptional. Mr. Carpe, 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, good afternoon. Je suis ravi d'avoir cette
I am
occasion.
pleased to have this opportunity to testify today regarding social confidence and civic engagement. I graduated from Université Laval many years ago, and I will also be pleased to answer in French today. I don't often have the opportunity in Alberta.
Topics: the rule of law and equality before the law. Secondly, how equity, diversity, inclusion, or EDI, undermines social trust. And thirdly, how the federal government can increase civic engagement. Social trust is the trust that Canadians have towards fellow citizens who are not family members, not friends. And it depends very heavily on the rule of law. La déesse romaine Justitia porte un...
There's a Greek goddess who wears a bandana so that she cannot see physical characteristics of the parties in front of her. The principle of that bandana is for everyone to have equal rights and no privileges for any. We cannot increase social trust when the legislation applies differently according to people's characteristics such as race or other personal characteristics. We have all been created in the image of God, and we all have a value as human beings.
States, whereas Canada is founded upon principles that recognize the supremacy of God and the rule of law, followed by a colon, not a period. And that means that the contents of the Charter flow from supremacy of God and the rule of law. Pour accroître la confiance sociale, il faut mettre la...
To increase trust, we need to focus on the things that bring us together instead of on what divides us. The rule of law is weakened, in fact, defeated when people see that their characteristics such as social background is seen.
Emphasizes division rather than emphasizing our common humanity. And so it necessarily leads to conflict and competition. And it promotes the idea that we must belong to a victim class or an oppressor class. And the emphasis is not on our common humanity. In the EDI ideology, the ultimate triumph comes when the victim group vanquishes and defeats and crushes the oppressor group. This is not an ideology that goes by the beautiful slogan you may have seen on bumper stickers that says, be the change that you want to be, be the change that you want to see in the world. The EDI ideology is focused on group rights. An example of this quite recently, the Musqueam Agreement became public in March, signed in secret, jeopardizing the property rights of over 2 million people in the Greater Vancouver area. It recognizes Aboriginal title, which is not just a right to hunt and fish, but that's actually ownership of the land. When you take away people's property or threaten to do so or create a scenario where that could happen, that is not the way to social trust or to reconciliation. Everyone in Canada is a settler or a descendant of the settler, and I have to ask the question, even with sections 25 and 35 of the Constitution, even with the Royal Proclamation, why do we create different legal rights for 95% of the people whose ancestors came from Europe and Asia and Africa in the last 500 years, and 5% of the population whose ancestors came here more than 500 years ago? So to increase the social confidence, the federal government can take steps to eliminate and abolish the EDI initiatives, race-based laws and policies. For example, abolish the Indian Act, repeal the agreement that was signed in secret in February with the Musqueam, and view all Canadians as first-class citizens under the principle equal rights for all, special privileges for none. I see I have 20 seconds left. And I'll say briefly that the government also should respect Section 92 of the Constitution Act, Division of Powers. If the government itself is not respecting the Constitution, it breeds a cynicism that is contrary to civic engagement. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. 3 for 3 to the witnesses for being at or under 5 minutes. The chair appreciates that. We will turn to Mr. Jackson for 6 minutes. A reminder, I cannot be my usual lax self on the timing, so I will be fairly strict on the time since we're running a little late.
Thank you, Chair. I'll do my best to recognize that. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. A pleasure to hear from you all. My questions are mostly for Professor Charlebois. I have to begin by thanking you for coming to Ag Days in January. That was in my constituency, hosted, for those of you who don't know, that's the largest indoor farm show in Western Canada, hosted annually in January in the Wheat City, and I've heard nothing but positive feedback from producers and those who just attended just to hear you speak. So I sincerely appreciate you coming out to Western Manitoba for that, and your comments about Canadian agriculture and food production and food security within the resiliency context of our nation. And so I want to thank you also for your opening comments about being clear about the industrial carbon tax. I wonder if you'd just repeat your view on the relationship between the industrial carbon tax and the price of fuel here, and if you believe that there is some relationship, then why doesn't the media report those factual inaccuracies with regard to the government's position on the industrial carbon tax and food prices?
Thank you for the question. It's been, as an academic, it's been very frustrating to talk to media, to try to convey to the public the academic work that we've been doing on the industrial carbon tax, peer-reviewed, published. Our focus is on the industrial part of the industry. So how the policy is impacting the competitiveness of the sector, of the ag sector, knowing that really margins are incredibly thin. It's always been our concern since day one. The focus out in the media with the public has always been retail. But we all know that in retail, prices can be impacted by hundreds of factors. And so when an economist says the carbon tax doesn't impact retail prices, from our standpoint, it's impossible to say that. You can't say that scientifically. But you can actually assess how the policy is impacting farmers, processors, and their competitiveness over time, which could obviously impact food security.
Thank you. So in terms of the witnesses that have presented up as part of this study, many of them, their main concern about civic resiliency has been information and disinformation on social media, and somehow getting mainstream media back onto Meta platforms specifically should solve some of the misinformation and disinformation, getting reputable journalism back onto Meta platforms. But if the mainstream media is refusing to report peer-reviewed evidence that you and your colleagues have done on their existing platforms, how would that, putting those platforms or those news articles back on Meta, really improve civic resilience if they're not reporting those facts through the streams that they have available to them now?
It's actually worse than that, because they actually call us, and when we tell them, when we give them our findings, they edit it. They just edit parts that they think the public will understand.
So you have had peer-reviewed research that reputable mainstream media journalists have then edited to change the facts of.
Well, I mean,
not the facts necessarily, but the results of.
They pivoted the discussion around retail and the consumer. So my guess is that they just tried to make sure that the information was easily understandable by the masses.
Switching gears a little bit, what do you think the biggest barriers are to increasing food production domestically within Canada?
Access to capital, private capital. We saw the RBC report yesterday, devastating. When you talk to farmers, when you talk to entrepreneurs, you can see that. And of course, the CFIB yesterday came out with a report saying that we're actually losing more companies than we're seeing new companies. That's a 4-year trend. it's happening in agriculture as well. There are fewer entrepreneurs getting into food, and that's a really big concern.
Biggest policy recommendation that you could share with this committee and by vicariously to the government about how we could change that investor environment to improve and increase the amount of investment in domestic food production?
I could share with the committee a report that we actually wrote with MNP. We're in a 5-year collaborative contract with them. We publish every year a report on, well, the exact point that you're talking about. And so it's 120 pages. So I can certainly share that report, but you probably would be able to get some answers.
That would be greatly appreciated, Professor.
French and English.
Yeah, that would be wonderful if you could share that in both official languages with us. My final question is the impact of food insecurity on the resiliency of Canadians, whether it's information resiliency, that type of thing. I just wonder if you could speak to the impacts of food insecurity.
It's we're slowly seeing the emergence of a K-shaped economy. You have the poor and the rich, and the middle class is slowly being eroded. In fact, I just wrote an op-ed this week about that, using data from Statistics Canada, showing that the middle, the 60% part, which is the middle class, is earning less compared to the top 20%, and the lower 20% is earning much less than 10 years ago. And without a stronger middle class, it's hard to innovate. It's hard to get entrepreneurs to be more interested in investing in agriculture in general.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go to Mr. Lewis for 6 minutes, please.
Great. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to the witnesses. I appreciate you being here today. A study that we're doing on civic resilience. We had a panel previously, and that was focused quite a bit on the next generation and how we can build civic resiliency. And I know that Ms. Leonard, you had listened to it, and sometimes when you're hearing a panel, you've got ideas and wish you could comment. So I wanted to give you a chance to comment on anything that you might have heard in the last panel's discussion, something you might want to add to that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think young people not only have a big stake in the future, but it's also an age where we have habit formation. So I think in terms of civic engagement and education, young people are, of course, like a priority population. We know, for example, around Get Out the Vote, that if young people vote or not in the first 2 elections in which they're eligible, that will determine kind of whether or not they vote across their life. So I think youth engagement is key.
Can we just stop for 1 second?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, if we can.
No worries.
Okay, please, sorry, continue. I won't time that against you.
Yeah.
Use that time against you.
So I think targeting young people is important for those 2 reasons. Yeah.
In your opening statement, the quote I wrote down was that you referred to civic resilience as the distance between people and institutions. I think at the end of the studies, we usually have to come up with a title, and I think I'm going to be pushing for that one right there. I do appreciate that. And then also in your opening statement, you've strongly suggested public funding. The Canadian Democracy Fund has been brought up a number of times. It sounds like it's an arm's length ranking and granting process. What governance model would be best to ensure that that remains nonpartisan, that it remains transparent, and that it remains insulated from any kind of political influence, while still being accountable?
So the government has done this before in other contexts. I think, for example, of the arts funding and other areas. So we've made 2 recommendations. One is the creation of the fund, and the second is a process through which to determine the governance, because I don't think we should have the answer. But I think to me there's 2 pieces. It's one, defining well what the fund is going to be supporting exactly, if we're talking about civic education, and how we define what that means to make sure that it's done in a nonpartisan fashion. And the second, to your point, is the question of the governance. And so, I think you can think in a more straightforward way about, for example, a board and thinking about the composition of the board, but you can also think more generally and, for example, having participatory determination of funding, for example, so that the decision-making within the fund embodies the principles that it's trying to reach as well. I kind of leave that to the details to a further consultation, but I think There's a spectrum of options, and I think that question of nonpartisanship is absolutely key. The reason we are asking for an independent and arm's length funding mechanism is because I think there's a real risk that the idea of democracy and of civic engagement becomes politicized if it is perceived to be so. And so the organizations that are doing this kind of work, for them, this part is key. And so the governance, I think we need to make sure to have broad consultation, get feedback on the framing of it to make sure that it reflects, that people with different ideologies are comfortable with it.
Perfect. But yes, but it sounds like you do support that it can be done in a nonpartisan, transparent way. Success leaves clues, and you talked about the EU and how they're also they're investing in democratic resilience and more than we are right here. So maybe we can learn from that. You referred to it as the democracy shield. Can you give some testimony as to some best practices that you see in other countries, whether it be EU or elsewhere, that you think can be applicable here in Canada, something we can use and learn from?
I can say a little bit more about the Democracy Shield. So the Democracy Shield is the general pro-democracy strategy that the European Union is currently putting in place. It encompasses a few different things. For example, there are Digital Markets Act, the Digital Services Act, so questions of policy and legislative reform. It involves the creation of an EU a Center for Democratic Resilience, I believe is the name, and then there's the Agora EU funding. And within that funding, there's 3 streams, so media, culture, and civic engagement. And then that is deployed to different countries across the EU. And that represents about, I think, I said it's 8 or 9 billion euro. So what we're recommending, if you compare it just to the civic engagement portion, is about a quarter, if on a per GDP adjusted basis of what the EU is currently investing in that area.
Thank you. That's helpful. In the last minute I have, you had pillars on your website. You had different pillars of what you wanted to expand on. One was fostering diverse participation. We heard a bit about diversity already, but I wanted to focus on underrepresented communities, and you said how you want to expand free, informed, and meaningful participation in public life. We want to make sure that in Canada, everyone has the same chances. So how would you expand on that pillar in the time we have left?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are big questions, the questions of how do we reach equality, and is it a question of form or is it a question of substance? I'm of the view that, we have the law, and the law should be impartial, but the law lands in a society in which we have inequities. And so, for example, if we think of the Luamba case that just went to the Supreme Court around a facially neutral law of being able to stop cars without suspicion and the impact that has disproportionately on certain populations. So I think, to me, the key part is making sure that any approach is determined by data and not by partisanry. So, for example...
I'll have to cut you off there. I do apologize.
Thank you.
We'll go to Madame Normandin. 6 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à l'ensemble. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being with us today. It's greatly appreciated. I'm going to start with you, Ms. Leonard. And Mr. Lewis already asked some of the questions that I wanted to ask, but I did have another one that I wanted to ask. While I was at the NATO Interparliamentary Association, there was a chair, Mr. Jerry Comley, who pushed for the creation for a Center of Democratic Resilience at NATO headquarters. Perhaps you've heard about it. I would like to know why it would be relevant to have such initiatives at a pan-national level and also at a more local level. Would it be redundant or would it complement? Would it be complementary to have these initiatives? You talked about proximity. Would it cause complementarity there? That's a great question. I think that it's essential to work with our allies on such matters. Some countries had to face situations before we did, and there are a lot of things that we can learn from them. We don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We could share best practices and accelerate our development here. Historically, we have taken our democracy for granted in a way. So we need to have international level exchanges, but we also need to have domestic level exchanges between provinces, for example, and ensure that we learn from Quebec, for example, regarding civic participation and have that shared throughout Canada. Thank you. And I would like to come back to that nonpartisan issue, as you mentioned. If people believe that the system is partisan, it becomes counterproductive. Can you give us examples? You talked about what happens elsewhere, but if we're talking about funding, you talked about, for example, boards or governance organizations that could decide which organizations would be receiving funding. Do you have any examples that you can share regarding what's done regarding funding and allocations? If I have, for Agora-U, I'm not sure how the funds are distributed, and the criteria are currently being worked on, so I'm not sure if they have the answer. But we need to look, for example, at journalism. There's a code of ethics regarding what journalism is, and having something like that for civic engagement could be relevant as well. I think that we need to have data on underrepresentation, on the demography of certain populations, which is something that is already being done by Election Canada for newcomers, for young people, for people with disabilities. When there are strategies that are more targeted, we need to ensure that they are focused on populations that are underrepresented. Coming back to funding yet again, I know that funding is really at the heart of most organizations, and in Quebec, there's a community group called ABUT that talks about funding that is unpredictable and not recurring, and it undermines certain initiatives. Would you focus on a funding model that would be more consistent for organizations that are working on civic resilience instead of funding allocated per project? Would it also seem less partisan to have some foreseeability with a 5-year plan, and then between elections, it doesn't feel as much like there would be a need for partisan funding? Funding to organizations is essential. I think that if everyone had funding according to their mission, that would be a significant improvement in the country. We focus on funding per mission, but we also have per project if there's a matter of collaboration. There could be a consultation on that specifically, but we also need to give funding to networks so that the things that we learn are able to be shared and implemented. Thank you. And briefly, with the time that I have, and again with you, before I move on to the next witnesses, can you talk about the collaboration between the different organizations who are working on democratic resilience? Is there one organization that receives funding and another doesn't? Would it be better to have funding that is better shared between organizations? I work in fundraising, and I am impressed by collaboration between organizations. You saw that in testimonies that you've heard. These are conversations that happen regularly. I believe that it comes from a feeling of urgency. No organization can face this alone, and they recognize that cooperation is the best way to have a bigger impact than acting alone. Thank you.
Cronus, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Professor Charlebois, your research specializes in food systems and supply chains. I come from Nanaimo Ladysmith on Vancouver Island, where it is often said that we have about 3 days of food supply at any given time. Food costs in my community are dramatically higher than in many other parts of the country. So I could talk to you for days. But I'm going to start with an overarching question around cost. Can you explain a little bit about how multiple distribution nodes and supply chain challenges and industrial carbon pricing contributes to the high prices that we experience on Vancouver Island and the worries that we have around food security and food sovereignty?
Appel au règlement, Monsieur le
Point of order, Chair.
est en
I
lien.
don't see how this question is related to the topic that we're studying today.
Get there if we can get there pretty quickly.
Well-
It's a pretty tenuous connection between this
But-
witness and civic resilience. So
So,
I will
let me-
only in this committee, one person speaks, one person listens. So please wait for me to finish. I will go back to you very quickly. If we can get to that fairly quickly, I've granted a lot of latitude with respect to this witness and this witness's opening remarks. So please get there quickly.
Can I start again with a different question?
Sure, go ahead.
Sure. Professor Charlebois, can you talk a little bit about the connection between food security and civic resilience?
Well, I mean, it's about understanding why food prices are going up, and it's about understanding food systems. And right now, I mean, if we want informed citizens, we want to make sure that they know the whole picture. And when we work on Canada's food price report every year with 30 different scholars from all over the country, we look at 47, 50 different factors. Climate change, we look at the cost of salaries, distribution, energy, geopolitics. There are so many different factors affecting food prices, and it's never. I think it's not fair for consumers to pinpoint one factor. For example, grocers exaggerating and things like that, and that seems to be the overwhelming, I would say, convenient argument out there that is being conveyed.
So in the context of the trust that Canadians need to have in pricing and government regulation of grocery stores and the cost of food, can you talk a little bit about how supply chain issues and things like industrial carbon pricing contribute to the high cost of food in communities like mine?
Well, I kind of answered that question earlier, and I would say it is a factor. It wouldn't be the overwhelming factor. Essentially, it's really about how to measure the entire spectrum. Right now, I would say that most analysis given that we see in the media will actually apply a linear analysis on the impact of the policy. What we do is look at the periphery, the whole thing, fertilizers, energy used to process everything, and that's when you see. So it's really a matter of scope, really. And I think that's kind of what's missing out there to allow Canadians to appreciate what's going on. And of course, I mean, grocers certainly deserve their share of blame. We just heard from the CBC the scaling issue with meat. That actually can increase the price of food just by either error, voluntary error, or error. But certainly, there are a lot of factors that can actually contribute, but it's important to give the big picture, the whole picture, so Canadians can appreciate exactly what's going on.
So what happens when there's a disconnect between people's understanding as to how prices are calculated and the information being provided by institutions to people's trust in those institutions?
It's a matter of consumer trust. Last year, we were arguing quite a bit that counter tariffs implemented by Ottawa were impacting many food prices at the grocery store. And it required the U.S. ambassador to Canada to finally say to Canadians in August that we were in breach of CUSMA with food. And that's when Prime Minister Carney, actually decided to eliminate all counter tariffs in September, finally. But it took months for us to say to Canadians, listen, counter tariffs are a problem. Counter tariffs are making food more expensive at the grocery store.
So in the context of that information gap, what's happening? What's the trend that you're seeing in your research around trust, Canadians' trust in our institutions?
Very quick answer.
Yeah, the more complex the actual, because science is about nuance. The more complicated it is to convey the big picture, the temptation is to simplify the message as much as possible, which undermines
Thank
trust.
you so much. I'll have to intervene there. We'll go to Madame Vanderbilt for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're on mute.
Returning. Am I on mute?
The microphone is too.
Microphone. The boom. Your boom mic. Your
My apologies, Mr. Chair. I should know better by now. Just returning to the subject of the current study, I'd like to direct a question to Ms. Leonard. I'm very interested in, and following on Ms. Normanden's questions, about sort of the difference between funding that would go to civic resilience and, say, regular funding that goes to different organizations around the country. You mentioned that the NATO Parliamentary Assembly is actually looking at democracy as fundamental to our security, to the foundation of our country. If you could talk a little bit about how this kind of a fund, if you know, and we're talking about, you know, small organizations for which I think a little bit of money would go a long way, but why that is something that needs public funding, because it is fundamental to, you know, our existence as a democratic country.
I think this on the there are a few parts of the question. On the question of public funding, I think if we decide that it's important, then it needs to be funded. And there are only so many options in terms of how this kind of work can be funded, of which government is part of the answer. I don't think it should be the complete answer, and that's also why I mentioned in my opening remarks that philanthropy is mobilizing in response to, you know, events around the world and seeing that this is important. So I don't think government would be alone at the table, either on co-funding different organizations or maybe in a closer collaboration. But ultimately, if we decide that this is important and that it needs to be independent, I think having multiple sources of funding is part of the answer. To your question around what it would fund exactly, I think, and I was hearing the end of the previous panel around issues of social cohesion, and that is so important, being able to, and to Madame Normandin's point about, you know, community organizations being overstretched, all of that is crucial. But I would distinguish kind of general work around civil society versus work that is about strengthening the connection between people and institutions. And that exists on a spectrum from education around voting, around the fact that you can come sit at committees, that, you know, that around misinformation, disinformation, media literacy, all of those questions. So from education to get out the vote and community mobilizing to having spaces where people can discuss complex issues, for example, citizens' assemblies. And I know you heard from Mr. McLeod and you know, the Center for Media, Tech and Democracy that you've also heard of, for example, has been doing these citizens' assemblies with young people around AI. These opportunities for people to understand the complexity of policy, I think, is also important in people having trust that policy decisions are made weighing factors appropriately. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. And maybe if you, in the few minutes remaining, could talk a little bit about the difference between constructive and productive engagement and the kind of inflammatory polarization that might happen when people are getting the information from sources that, you know, they're not engaging that way. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the difference between the two.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, democracy fundamentally is about whether or not people are heard. We work with a consultant, Steve Lee, who said it very well. I've never heard someone talk about democracy so succinctly. He said, democracy ultimately is, do I get what I want? And if I don't, do I understand why? And do I think it's fair? And I think having the feeling of being heard is so important in being able to accept outcomes when outcomes may not be going in your favor. And we all know here, you know this better than most, that we can't serve the interests of everyone 100% all the time. We wish it, and that's not possible. But having procedural fairness, I think, is important. And so I'm a big advocate for the fact that we need to reach across divides, to have spaces where people can discuss complexity, and to come to realize, you know, I think Mr. McLeod mentioned in his testimony, but when we bring people together over time, people realize that they have a lot more in common than the things that divide them. And so I think time together, discussing real issues, is one of the ways in which we can you know, make progress on complex policy decisions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We will now go to Madame Normandin, 2.5 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup. J'aimerais maintenant...
Thank you. My questions are now for Mr. Carpe, and you can answer in French if you'd like. You talked about EDI standards, and you stated that it can be divisive instead of inclusive. And I would like for you to talk about theories that support that. For example, humanism versus multiculturalism, because this is a discussion that is happening in Canada. We're saying that humanism focuses on common values, whereas multiculturalism focuses on differences between groups that need to coexist. So do you side more on the side of humanism or multiculturalism? I don't see them as opposite sides. I believe that multiculturalism can work well as long as there's a foundation. It's a mosaic. We need glue to bring all of these aspects together. Multiculturalism can work well if people believe that rules are fair because they apply to everyone and they don't single out groups because they have ancestors who came here a long time ago. If there's a legal distinction, well, then people will feel like there's a lack of justice, and that will undermine solidarity. For example, the Musqueam Agreement in Vancouver. That's not bringing people together. For those who bought a home, it's no longer clear if they can keep that home that they paid a lot of money for. And there's a minority of people who could potentially, probably benefit from that. That's divisive. That does not help reconciliation. Inaudible for the interpreter.
Merci.
Can we go on to Mr. Van Popta for 5 minutes, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to all the witnesses. Mr. Carpe, I have a question for you. I'm looking at a briefing note that we have from the Library of Parliament, prepared by our very capable analysts, so thank you for that. And in it, they cite some Statistics Canada information about the degree of confidence that Canadians have in several of our important democratic institutions, one of them being our criminal justice system. And apparently only 48.2% of Canadians have confidence in our criminal justice system, which seems pretty startling to me. So I don't know if you have a comment about that. I know you're legally trained. You talked about, the rule of law and equality and race-based policies. We have race-based sentencing. And, we have, what we not to be partisan, right, but what we call catch and release bail rules. And now we also have sentencing based on people's immigration status. So just wonder, and we're talking about civic resilience now, so keep that in mind. That's the focus of my question.
So there's been a lot of media coverage in recent months, some very high-profile cases. I'm not going to describe them or elaborate on them, but where the judge expressly writes into his judgment this person would have received a much harsher sentence, deserves a harsher sentence, but we had this special report, sorry, I forget the name of it, and so this person gets a lighter sentence because he's black or because he's Aboriginal. That, I think, rubs the vast majority of Canadians the wrong way, and I think that creates, again, it creates conflict and division between people because there's this sense of unfairness and this is favoritism. We have to remember as well that long before the Gladue decision of the Supreme Court of Canada, which was in respect of special sentencing considerations for Aboriginals, long before that decision, it has always been in the discretion of the judge to take note of the accused person if they had a horrible childhood, they had abusive alcoholic parents, horrible youth, and didn't have the opportunities, didn't have guidance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The judge already had and still has the jurisdiction to take that into account. So in my view, it was a mistake, well-intentioned. Everybody has good intentions, I don't question that. But to say, well, we need special sentencing considerations for Aboriginals, it's not necessary, it's divisive. That special consideration was already in place long before Gladue or the current policies.
Good. Well, thank you for that. So I just want to tie this back to the study of the day, and that is civic resilience, and the disturbing, what I think is the disturbing stat that more than half of Canadians don't have confidence in this important democratic institution. So what does that do for our sense of community, our sense of civic resilience? I know these policies are well-intentioned, but maybe they don't work out the way they were intended.
Your question has expressed my point. I don't question that the EDI initiatives are with good intentions of helping people who are disadvantaged, who have a harder time in life, who have conditions that are beyond their control, make it harder to get ahead, etc. I completely understand EDI initiatives are well-intentioned, and I also think they are counterproductive because they make it harder to have unity, say, between men and women, between gay and straight people, between dark-skinned people, light-skinned people. That common humanity, if you're always emphasizing, well, you belong to a victim group, you're an oppressor group, that is so counterproductive to getting along and to respecting each other. So again, these initiatives have good intentions, but I think that they're destructive and toxic, and they undermine social trust between people.
Do we still have a minute, Chair?
You have 50 seconds.
Good. 50 seconds for Professor Charlebois. I read that recent editorial in the Canadian Grocer, I think, just very, very recent. You say healthy food economy depends on a strong middle class. I find it somewhat ironic that after 10 years of a government that wanted to enhance the middle class, and they even had a Ministry of Middle Class Prosperity, you talked about the K economy, things are going in the wrong direction. So I wonder if you could just comment on what a prosperous middle class, or a lack thereof, does to a sense of civic resilience in our country.
It affects us all. Why? Because the top 20%, they're still buying beef at plus 15, lamb at plus 8. They'll buy caviar and crab and lobster, pushing prices higher, penalizing the people who actually are trying to make ends meet. They're dealing with the same inflation.
We'll have to go on to Madame Brière, s'il vous plaît. 5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Madame Leonard.
Thank you, Chair. Ms. Leonard, and thank you to all the witnesses for your testimonies. Ms. Leonard, you talked about the Canadian Fund, the $20 million. Which sector would require the most support in your view? And what shortcomings would that solve, potentially? Thank you for the question. It depends on the scope. We could include a lot of things in that. One of the pillars that is missing in current funding from the federal government, well, there's the Digital Citizens Initiative, there are different initiatives, and there are things missing for civic engagement. How do we ensure that people become closer to their institutions? We need to do education and awareness campaigns so that people understand, and we want people to be able to vote. We want their voices to be heard. Organizations that work on that, well, that's where there's really a shortcoming or a gap, but there are things that need to be supported, for example, journalism. Thank you. Mr. Charlevoix, you often undermine the quality of journalism because of their funding, even though you're focused on a small part of their funding. And what do you believe about your credibility if you are entirely funded by public funds as a university professor? I want to correct you. For La Presse, for example, they put an end to my collaboration. They made $9 million, and they received 15 million in tax credits, so that's not nothing. And as an academic, as a researcher, I felt like there was an influence. I was working for 25 years in the media, and for the last 3-4 years, things have felt different. Regarding funding from government, that's fine. I support Radio-Canada and CBC, but for private media, we know that it's a partisan issue now. Thank you. I'll give my time back to the chair.
As chair to ask a few questions, and I'll start with you, Professor Charlebois. It sounds like your argument with respect to media is that if you had 300 experts on one side saying one thing, and one expert on the other side saying the other thing, it should be reported the same way as two sides of the same coin. Is that what you're trying to tell us? Is the reason that you're being excluded from the media? Or you're not being?
I'm not being excluded at all.
I see you a lot. That's my surprise is that you're here saying that you can't get into one newspaper, but you're in every other newspaper across the country. And are you telling us that freedom? La Presse should not have the freedom to include or not include who they would like?
Oh, they absolutely should. It's
Okay.
just the reason they used to dismiss me was troubling to me.
Okay, well,
that's
I
why.
suppose it's
But
troubling to all of us if we're dismissed. And just to confirm, sorry, Mr. Charlebois, I looked through your university website just to confirm you are well studied in food and food security and whatnot. Compared to our other academics who've been here, it would be fair to say you have not done research in civic resilience. Is that a fair thing to say?
It's fair. I'm not an expert in civil.
Thank
absolutely.
you so much.
Point of order, Mr. Chair.
A point of order?
Yeah, I'm just curious. We've had a number of witnesses over many days of study on this. I'm not sure I've seen the chair question the expertise of any other witness, and so I'm just wondering why that's happening.
Sounds like debate. Not a point of order. Mr. Carpe, with respect to your comments on inclusion and diversity, and I can understand where you're coming from. Is that why you compared the pride flag to swastika?
Well, you need to get your facts straight on that with respect. I made a point, and I'll make it again today, that any flag can be, and any symbol can be used to attack rights and freedoms. You can violate human rights under the Canadian flag, the American flag, the Israeli flag, etc.
So that's a yes?
I was misquoted
Thank
by
you.
media, and I don't think it's a fair point that you're making with respect.
Fair enough. And it's surprising to me that even in your questioning, the Conservatives talked about law and order. And that's a big thing they talk about. You were disbarred from 2 law societies, is that correct, for having the Chief Justice of Manitoba tailed and surveilled? Is that true, Mr. Carpe?
No, it's not true. I resigned from the Law Society of Alberta in 2023. I've not been disbarred in Manitoba. I've never been a member there. And after I resigned from the Law Society of Alberta, after disciplinary proceedings were fully concluded in Manitoba, the Alberta Law Society decided to commence a brand new prosecution, and that is the status of where things are at. And I'm not sure what this has to do with civic resilience, with respect.
When you talk about, well, you're the one that brought up the rule of law. Does the rule of law include having judges tailed?
The rule of law includes judicial independence, period.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much. And this committee stands adjourned.